I'm John Bishop with 1620 The Zone, celebrating 25 years. And today my special guest is Kevin Kugler, who was a member of the team from 1899 to 1914. And he joins us on this special edition of the 25th anniversary show. Kevin, you look great for 118 years old.
I was just thinking back the other day, John, when you came in and announced your retirement the day we were starting the Zone. And I thought, you know what? John had a long, illustrious career, and it was time for me to take over then. And so I went out and I cranked my car up to start it, and off we went. And here we are. The rest is history, as they say. But it was nice of you to come back out of retirement, much like our former boss, Neil Nelkin, has done 17 times and been able to be a part of this episode of 25 years of 1620 The Zone, delighting Omaha with its sports knowledge.
It's incredible that AM radio still exists 25 years after it was invented in 1899. But in all seriousness, I thought we would focus on a very specific and I think probably the most important time, not only in the show's history, unsportsmanlike conduct, but in the station's history, because I think it's where everything changed, not only for the Zone, for the show, but for sports talk in Nebraska. Because I think, we can go back, Kevin, we did our college show together 30 years ago, and it was a much different time. And obviously, it was it was the very beginnings of sports talk. The main sports talk stations in New York and other major cities had just gotten on the air. And so it was all new to all of us. But the one thing I think that we probably engaged in as much as anyone was it was very fan friendly. It was very Homer centric radio back then. And it was easy to be that way because Nebraska was winning all the time. And then things changed about 10 years in with, of course, the arrival of the person we all know and love as Steve Peterson, a.k.a. The Vision. But first, let's go back. Tell me, just give me an idea of what things were like in the early days of the show, starting in 2000, going up to 2003, just how different the world of sports talk was at that point.
Well, and it was very different. We were still trying to figure out exactly how we were going to do it. And I was fortunate. I was paired to start the show with Bob Bruce, and I didn't know Bob at all. I'd never met him until we started doing the show together. But the founder, essentially, of all that we know as the Zone, Neil Nelkin, thought we would be a good pairing. I was doing Maverick football and basketball. That was when UNO had a football team, and UNO football and basketball was on the Zone, and I was working with Neil Nelkin on that, and he thought we'd be able to do a talk show, and he paired me with Bob Bruce, and I was fortunate because Bob came from a morning show background. I came from a play-by-play background, and I still didn't really know what I was at that point. And Bob wanted to do and thought we should do a show that was not some just stats callers show. He wanted to do it more like a morning show where you'd do bits and you'd have fun and you'd be goofy and you would, because his theory, and I subscribed to this, he taught me well. His theory was that, you're driving to work in the morning and morning shows are being fun and having silly things go on. Why, when you're driving home, wouldn't you want that too? And so that was kind of the approach that we took to it. But you're right, it was a lot less hot takey. It was a lot less contentious around here because, look, Nebraska was coming off of still very successful football at that time. Frank Solich's regime was going on strong. 2001, they were playing for a title in the Rose Bowl. We went out to the Rose Bowl and covered it. I mean, it was a different time for sports talk. But then everything turned when Nebraska football turned in 2002. And everybody started to get a little angry. It got a little more contentious. If you didn't, Bob and I still joke about the fact that at one point some caller suggested that we were swinging on the testicles of Jamal Lord at one point because we were being positive about the play of Jamal Lord in a certain game. It was a different time, but it did all turn right around 2002, 2003 when Nebraska football started to sink. That's really when sports talk had to evolve.
See, because I remember, when we did our show back at KRNU, it was all about, fighting the battle for the school, right? Mm-hmm. I still remember the show we did where at that point, Nebraska, Alabama, and Penn State were all like and we were debating on who should be number one. This was about halfway through the season, and that's kind of the way it was.
Right.
And then, certainly the year after that with the Lawrence Phillips thing, it felt like kind of us against the world. But I'm curious, was there a point inside of 2002, the 7-7 season, where at least internally in your mind, you're thinking, I may have to pivot here. I can't necessarily defend everything I'm seeing on the field.
Yeah, and it happened during that time because by that point I'd had 2 years of doing sports talk under my belt. So I was at least a little more comfortable. I wasn't very comfortable with opinions when I first started. From a play-by-play standpoint, my job was to describe what was happening on the field or on the court, and that was what I took seriously. And so I really struggled for a while being opinionated. It was difficult for me to do because I was very sensitive in the early days to the backlash that you'd get because, that was the early days of message boards and all of this social commentary where people could find you easier. And I was a young parent. I was a, relatively young married guy at that point, although it'd been several years. But still, it was, you're just trying to figure out who you are. And that was different for me. And I had to really learn how to become opinionated. And that was what taught me that, was because you couldn't go out there and say, hey, guys, everything's fine. I mean, this looks great. It's all outstanding. The way I tried to temper it was I was on the Frank Solich bandwagon, if you will. And I thought Frank deserved a chance to reset with a new staff. My opinion was, you saddled him with some guys who were clearly not interested in doing the job at the same level they had been, or not capable of doing the same job that they had been. And you should have given this man a chance to retool post that staff that carried over from the Osborne regime. And even that was controversial at the time, which in hindsight seems silly. But at the time, you have to remember these were legendary coaches that were on this staff. And to have anyone say, gosh, maybe they can't do what they need to do was somewhat, oh boy, you don't do that. And so that was a little bit of a challenge to navigate that time while trying to figure out how to be an opinionated sports talker while also trying to grow a play-by-play career, which it's hard to marry the two.
Yeah.
But that was really where sports talk had to change because you couldn't just go on the air. We would have been immediately dismissed. We were not the mouthpiece of the university. We were not Sports Nightly, Sports whatever it was at that time. I think it had changed by that point, but maybe it was still Sports Day Mid-America. Either way, you couldn't be that, and you've hosted that show. You know what you had to do in that show. We couldn't be that show because that you have no credibility at all as the underdog in that situation, coming out and parroting the same line that the university is parroting.
Do you remember the first time you saw your name on a message board and people letting you have it for a take you had?
It was sometime in the 2002 season, and I remember seeing it, and I don't remember what the take was, but I remember seeing it and thinking, man, this is different. And it bothered me. I won't lie. That bothered me a little bit at that. Now, obviously, decades later, I could give a rip. But then I was disturbed. I'm like, I'm a Nebraskan. I live here. This is my home. How could you people do this? It was a lot of hand-wringing in my mind of, oh my gosh, I've ruined everything. What am I going to do? And then you quickly learn that none of it matters, and it all goes away the very next day. But it was at the time I was very disturbed by that. But it helps callous you, and that's what you have to have a relatively thick skin to do this business anyway right now. And nobody's going to feel sorry for you if somebody rubs you the wrong way with a comment, which is fine. But it was at the time, it was a very difficult pill to swallow, thinking, wait a minute, I'm a native Nebraska guy. How could I possibly offend any of you?
Yeah.
I went ahead and offended others as the years went on.
Well, okay. Speaking of that, of course, another native Nebraskan comes home, takes over the AD's job. And we all remember at the time, at least I remember at the time, how a lot of people felt. And that was, hey, Steve Peterson's back here. Everything's going to be fine. He's an Osborne guy. We're going to get this back on track. Solich was given the opportunity to rebuild his staff. He brings on Bo Pelini, and 2003 is upon us. And I guess I don't know how you felt, Kevin, but going into that season, I thought, okay, here's our chance to kind of heal everything that had happened. Because 2002, this is going to sound weird to a lot of younger folks, but 7-7 just felt like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. So then 2003 comes up, and we're all thinking everything maybe going to be fun. I'm curious, where were you going into 2003?
I thought it was a chance for Nebraska to really set themselves back on track. Because, and look, anybody who tells you that they didn't think Steve Peterson was the right hire in 2003 is lying to you. It was universally praised. It was a lot like the Scott Frost hire years later, where almost everybody thought that was 100% the right choice. Nobody thought there was another option. And nobody thought there was another option at that time. This was the guy who knew how to get it done. Everybody knew it. And then you knew as the season went along that you could kind of sense, you heard a lot of stuff. And that was, there were a lot of leaks in the ship at that point. And there were a lot of people saying, telling you things behind the scenes. You didn't have to look very far or look very hard to find somebody within the program who was going to tell you some of the stuff that was going on. And it was very obvious at that time that I don't know that there was any way, in hindsight, I don't know if there's any way Frank Solich could have saved his job short of winning a national championship. Because for Steve, it was all about recruiting and what you were going to do to recruit for the future. And he didn't feel like, and look, you had two different goals. Steve Peterson's goal was you got to be able to recruit big-time players for the future. Frank Solich's goal was to save the job and right the ship of the program in the short term. That was the only thing he was worried about, is how can we get this thing back on track quickly? And they did, to the tune of 10-3 that season. But of course, by the 10th win, he wasn't around to relish in that. That was the bowl win. But it was one of those situations where at the beginning, everybody knew this was going to be the right move. This was the right hire. And it quickly turned out to be not the case at all.
Do you remember at what point in 2003? Because for those who don't recall that season, they did win 10 games. Solich was there for 9. Bo's defense was an amazing turnaround, which is a big reason why he was such a popular hire when he came around as head coach. But the losses were all bad. There was the Texas loss that was a blowout. There was the Missouri loss that was a blowout, and the Kansas State loss, which we can maybe talk about a little bit later on, because that was the day where it appeared like everything had come apart between the two. But do you remember a moment in 2003, whether it was hearing from people on the inside or the scuttlebutt or just what the lay of the land was, where it was like, oh, this thing might be coming apart here?
Yeah. And, the Missouri loss was the first loss. And that one you could write off a little bit. They were on the road. It didn't really derail them a significant amount. I think they were a top 10 team, if I remember correctly, when they went down to Missouri, and they didn't fall out of the top 20. I knew that, and they were able to climb back up because they were number 12 in the country when they went to Texas, and there was a lot of hype around that game. And I think the Texas game was the first time you really started to hear people inside the program grumbling, because there was, to their mind, a significant gap between the talent level at Texas and the talent level at Nebraska, and that was what Steve Peterson's entire plan was the talent level was not where it needed to be. We're not going to surrender the Big 12 to Oklahoma and Texas. Well, in that game, it looked like Nebraska had surrendered the talent edge to Texas in a significant way. But the one that obviously did all the damage was, and the nail in the proverbial coffin, was the K-State game. A, it was a blowout. B, it was at home. And that was the only one of those 3 bad losses that was at home for Nebraska. And you just remember that day thinking, oh boy, this isn't good. The 3 best teams, I put best in quotes, the 3 best teams they played that year, they got destroyed by. 2 of them were on the road. So you kind of, all right, well, it's hard to win on the road. But the K-State game was the one where you knew it was going to be really hard for Frank at that point. And I still thought there was a good chance that he would be able to do it. Remember, they went to Colorado that last week of the year, and they won that game. And there was, all the talk about how Steve Peterson didn't meet him out of the locker room and there wasn't anybody there. There was a whole lot of feeling that he had saved his job, even with the win in Colorado. And obviously that wasn't the case.
What was your reaction, your gut reaction, when you heard that he was being fired? And of course, this is the day after the Colorado game. Yeah,
I was disappointed. We did a show, and I guess they'd call it an emergency pod now, but there was no such thing as pods. So we did an emergency show, And we were on the air late into the night, and we had, Barney Cotton came on, and all these guys came on with us, and they were all, as you might imagine, very disappointed. And the fan base, I think, was, at the time, I felt like it was split. I don't know that you'd go back now and find these same people and think that it was split. There were still a lot of people who thought, yeah, this has got to go because of what they had in these games against Missouri, Texas, and Kansas State. And at the time, I remember I became very outspoken. I said at the time I thought he should have kept his job. I thought he had earned another opportunity to show what he could do with the program. And I mean, this has been relitigated for 20 years, but that was the first real bold stance that you took against the prevailing feeling of what the university was doing. And look, we had deposed coaches on, we had all this stuff on, and that was the first night that you really felt like, okay, this thing's going to grow, our show and our station. This is going to grow into something bigger than what it had been for the first couple of years. It was a nice, steady growth. But I tell people all the time, the best thing that happened to that radio show and to that station was Nebraska football falling on hard times, because it had so many people passionately interested in what was going on with the program again, from one side or the other. And we were the ones that were on the air talking about it every single day. And we were the ones on the air talking about it outside of the official station of the Huskers. And that was the big thing, too. We could draw a direct contrast with what was being said on the mouthpiece stuff.
The counterculture, we'll call it, notion of the show.
Yep.
Could you tell right away that you were swimming upstream? Or and keep in mind, we're talking 20, 25, almost 25 years ago. The idea of, tribalism has always been there. It seems more pronounced today than it did then. But to give folks an idea, it was not usual to counter what the official university line was. It just wasn't. And so if anyone, I can remember some of the most benign opinions being written in the day, whether it was Chattel or maybe going back a little further, Mike Kelly, just talking about Nebraska should throw the ball more and how that would stir people up. That was the nature of how everyone was in lockstep with the program. Did you feel like initially, late 2003, right before the firing, maybe right after the firing, you were swimming upstream, or could you tell that there was already a counterculture movement going against the grain of what we had been traditionally thought of as, being everyone in the same boat?
I don't know that you felt it initially. I think it sort of, like everything else at that time, evolved. Our show evolved, the station evolved, the mood evolved. And, I'm not arrogant enough. I'm very arrogant, but I'm not arrogant enough to think that somehow we made that change happen, because we're a low power AM radio station that, but we were the sports talk show that was being different by criticizing and not just saying, gosh, I thought maybe they should have run the ball on third down, but actually saying, this athletic director made a bad decision. And then he compounded it with that ridiculous coaching search that allowed us to just absolutely hammer away. It was a joke. And everybody who wasn't affiliated at the time with the university knew that. And that was really the first time where you could see, does this guy really have any idea what he's doing? Does he really know how to approach this? Does he really have a plan in place for what happened? And, I can remember this as clear as day. And I'm not going to say the name of the person because that person is still around. But there was a university employee who, in the midst of 2004, we were still covering the Tuesday press conferences. And so, and this, John, we had a little booth up there that we would set up our stuff, and I would do the show from there because I was hosting Big Red Wrap Up that night, which also was a bit of a balancing act. And so I would do the Tuesday press conferences, and I'd sit in that show. And so I was up there every week. And I can remember a university employee came up to me at one point, and it wasn't an SID person, none of the good people in sports information, but this was somebody higher up, said, you got to be really careful here because, Steve Peterson used to think a lot of you, but you got to be really careful how you tread here. And I remember walking away from that conversation And I remember thinking at the time, are we really having that kind of an impact on this? That the athletic director is sending out his minions to say to me, hey, watch your back, watch your back. I would learn a couple of years later as the Peterson regime rolled on that was absolutely the case when they yanked the baseball rights away from NET in an effort to keep me from broadcasting Nebraska baseball. And they ended up shifting him to Cox Cable for a year. But that was the first realization that I had that, like, this was different. We were doing something different that nobody had happened to them around here. It happened elsewhere. I mean, it's not like New York hadn't experienced this for decades, but to have it happen in, good old Nebraska with dear old Nebraska U from somebody who was an alum and, was involved in some ways covering the program. That was different, but that was the first time that I really had the notion that, holy crap, this station is making headway here. We're actually doing something here that's rattling the cage.
Were you intimidated by that? Was there a part of you, and like you said, you were also hosting Big Red Wrap Up, so which was very much more of a straight across the board, just kind of a newsy show, not as much an opinion show,
right? Just
highlights. But was there a point where you were like, I do need to dial this down? Do you remember the internal struggle you may have had? Because I can imagine what that would feel like, having been an alum, having, been around the program, maybe having dreams of one day being in the radio booth. Did you feel like, oh, I got to back this off?
No, it angered me. I remember being annoyed by it. And I remember thinking, I'm not employed by you. Big Red Wrap Up wasn't an athletic department endeavor, so I wasn't employed by them. And they, I give full credit because I had these conversations. You know him, but a lot of people don't know the name Jim Carmichael, who was the longtime producer of a lot of NET sports, and he and Joe Turco, who was in charge of the division at the time and was for many years after, both had my back in a lot of difficult conversations where you had athletic department employees meeting with NET people saying, we don't want him involved in this. We don't want him involved in this. I have notes from the meetings that Jim, God rest his soul, gave me after the meetings where they came in and basically tried to get me off of NET and try to push me away because I was being critical on a radio show of the university. And all of that, at the first, there were moments where I was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? What's happening here? But I became kind of emboldened by the fact that, look, my main job was to do a sports talk show. And I had to be, one of the other things I learned from Bob was you kind of have to live your life on the air. You don't have to tell everybody every single detail of your life, but you kind of have to live your life on the air. And so you have to be genuine. You have to be authentic. And so I always tried to be that. I think I always was. I mean, we're goofy, but I'm goofy. So I was authentic with people on the air, but I had to be authentic with how I felt. I couldn't go out there and go, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. What's one losing season? I mean, it's fine. There were just certain things that you had to do, and everybody's going to be mad at you one way or the other. So you may as well go with what you believe. And that's what I did. And it was, it was an interesting time. I'll just say that it was an interesting time. And, it was well known. John Mabry wrote an article about it in 2006 in the Journal Star talking about, whether or not I was being banned by the university. And Steve Peterson gave some sort of political answer. I don't remember what it was at the time. Something like, well, we just like to have the say on who broadcasts games that we do. And it was that moment where, John, you just kind of knew that, all right, this is different, and let's see where it goes.
Without Jim, without Joe, and we'll get to Neil in a second, without those two, do you think things would have been different, that you would have basically had to back off at that point?
No, I think I would have had to give up Big Red Wrap Up and probably stopped doing play-by-play for NET, which would have perhaps meant a different path in my career than where I am now. But without their backing, I think it would have been really difficult for me to keep doing that. My main job and my main source of income was the radio show. And, I had 2 kids at the time and still married, and, we're trying to make a go of it. And I would have had to do what I had to do to make sure my family was housed and fed. And so I would have, unfortunately, I probably, had I not had that kind of backing, and thank the good Lord I did, but if I had not had that kind of backing of really good people who knew me and knew I wasn't doing anything wrong, it would have been very different. But I've been blessed. You and I both have. We've had a lot of good people in our corners over the years. And, you mentioned, obviously I mentioned Jim Carmichael and Joe Turco at NET. And then maybe the biggest name on that list is Neil Nelkin, who always had our back. I can't even tell you how much crap he had to shield us from, because I don't know it, because he never said it. And he always shielded us from all of the junk from the brass or the fans or whoever, because that was his job. And he was he's one of the best bosses I will have ever had. Regardless of where I work and what I do for the rest of my career, it's going to be hard to come up with one better than Neil Nelkin.
What were the meetings like with Neil? You mentioned he shielded you from a lot of stuff. Maybe didn't tell you everything that he was being told from Chris Anderson or other people in the athletic department.
No, he didn't.
Chris Anderson, who at the time was the SID and, would occasionally call the radio station to issue some complaints about maybe some things that were said. Was there ever a moment where Neil said, guys, you might want to dial it down a bit?
No, here's the thing that I've always found funny. There are a lot of people who believe that we as broadcasters are told to say things like they're asked, oh, you guys are just saying this because of this. No one ever told us to say anything. In my decade plus at the Zone, not one person ever came in and said, hey, I think you guys should do X, Y, or Z. Now, there were things that we'd said that then we had to answer for, like any other job. We had this, we had meetings about, why would Michael say at one point, I'm thinking about the penis? I mean, there were things like that we had to answer for. But, none of them got us fired, which was good. Obviously. But it was you cannot do this without having the support of people around you and above you, because there's just too much flack. I used to joke all the time on the air how we were just trying our darndest to get boycotted and or picketed, and we never did. I think it would have been a lot easier today to get picketed. It seems like everybody wants to picket or boycott anything at any time. I feel like we could have gotten it done in 2024 much easier than we could have in 2008. But Neil was always the guy who stood in the way of those phone calls and stood in the way of those complaints. And quite honestly, John stood in the way of a boss or two that was upset with things that we said on the air. And he told them, these guys have to have the free reign to do it. And the good thing was 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, and then Michael and I are growing the show. It started to show in the ratings. And that was really the bottom line. Once you had the ratings to back it up, there really wasn't a whole lot that the bosses were going to do. Why would you kill this thing? Why would you complain about this thing that's doing the job that these people were asked to do?
Quick aside for a story. The day that Frank gets fired, the official press conference, it's Sunday. You're up there. As you mentioned, you would go up there, and any day it was the Tuesday press conference, you'd set up in the booth. You were set up in the booth for this. We're standing there in the 6th floor press conference room where they used to do all the press conferences. And all of a sudden, a very giant man comes over our shoulder
there
and starts interrogating Steve Peterson. What do you remember of when Bernard Thomas basically did a run-in on the press conference?
That was one of the great press conference moments in my life. And you and I are standing right there. I mean, right on that side at the press conference, kind of towards the back of the room. And here comes Bernard Thomas. And I thought Bernard Thomas was going to go over there and tackle Steve Peterson. He was absolutely livid. And I'll give Steve credit. He handled that pretty well, because that could have been a really bad situation. But I do remember standing there next to you, and you and I are looking at each other like, Oh, here we go. We're here for history. We're about to see a football player at a college go after an athletics director. This is going to be a wild thing, and we have a front row seat to it. And then, of course, the infamous picture of the elevator afterwards, where they're all writing down together, and you're thinking, how is this real life? And again, this is a university in which there was never a contentious anything. It was for decades, the most milquetoast press conferences in the history of mankind. Frank Solich, Coach Osborne. I mean, you never had anything. The most contentious Osborne thing was during the Lawrence Phillips era, when you had Armin Katayan and Bernie Goldberg coming in and asking edgy questions. At the time, for us, it was really edgy in Nebraska. But that was it. You never had anything on those. And then all of a sudden, this whole circus developed for the next however many days and weeks, and it all kicked off with Bernard Thomas. That was a day.
And by the way, I think Bernard maybe asked the best questions of that press conference.
I agree. I agree. He didn't get any good answers, but Steve danced around the answers without antagonizing the situation, which I thought was smart on his part. And Bernard came in with passionate, interesting questions that he had no fear in asking. Speaking truth to power was not a problem for Bernard Thomas on that day.
No, it was not. You mentioned the ratings, and of course that would come with time. But was there a moment, was there a show, was there a time that you can recall where you thought, hey, what we're doing is working here, and we need to stay on this course because this is going to be good for us in terms of not only the show, but the radio station?
2004, at the end of the season, when Scott Frost called in after Turner Gill was let go and left. And when Turner left and Scott called in just on his own, and he was driving somewhere, and he was as passionate and as emotional as anyone could be in that scenario, because he loved Turner Gill, obviously. And Scott called in and went on this diatribe about this, and it was amazing radio. It was amazing radio. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, that's going to be a big deal. That's going to get play. And it did. I mean, it was a pivotal moment for the show, because it showed we were enough of a player at that point that people thought of us when that happened. And I'd worked with Scott a little bit, and so I knew him a little bit outside of just the call-in radio show world. But we'd started to gain traction with former players. We'd started to gain traction with people who were close to the program, and that was really where you kind of felt that things were happening at that point. Like, okay, we're not just some goofy little low-powered radio station now. We're a little low-powered radio station on the expanded band of the AM dial, but all of a sudden we've got some sort of a following, and we had a voice, and we were using our voice in a way that was different than other people had used it before. And that was really the start of things again for 1620 The Zone. Our show started September 18th of 2000. And I would say the firing of Frank Solich took it to a different level. Then the 2004 season took it to another level. I was sitting in that press conference when Bill Callahan said, it's just one game, one season. And I knew that was going to be a defining soundbite, because that wasn't the case then. Right now, a losing season seems to be one game, one season every year. But then that was a big deal. And it was just another moment where this station continued to climb and grow. And, it took bad things for the Nebraska fan base for that to happen, but it also took that to get people upset. It shows the passion of the fan base, because people were livid, people were upset, and people wanted a place to voice their frustrations. And the only other option was the university's sports talk show, and they weren't going to get in there to voice those frustrations.
Did you ever consider the show the leader of the counterculture movement?
No, not really. Because I am hardly a counterculture person. I mean, I Well, really, I mean,
No, you're not.
I could never be the leader of any counterculture movement. I'm a middle-aged white guy, and I was then. To with two small children and a picket fence. What counterculture am I leading? I mean,
but from a Husker standpoint, from a Nebraska standpoint.
From a coverage standpoint, we were different, and it was unique. It was unique to have goofy bits that made fun of the program. It was unique to have controversial topics. It was unique to have controversial guests who would rip the program and not be afraid to do so. It was a unique situation to be able to allow callers to rip the program in a public setting. That just didn't happen. Now, there wasn't a lot to rip before the show. I mean, before we started, it was a pretty steady stream of success. You weren't ripping a lot of things in 1997. But there was a need for that outlet at that time, and we were fortunate enough to be the ones who filled that void.
Do you think, not that Michael needed any help, because he has always been his own individual and he's never cared necessarily about what others thought, but he was new into the show. Yep. He was new into the market, essentially. Do you think that time helped him find his voice?
I think he helped both of us. It helped him find his voice because he'd really never done it before. And it helped me because, A, I had somebody to play off of, and B, Michael's never been afraid to express his football opinion because Michael studies and Michael watches and Michael comes at it with an informed opinion. You may disagree with his opinion, but it's not going to be because he's not informed about the opinion, which is always something I appreciated. He was never afraid to say it, and he usually backed it up with, well, I watched 4 hours of football tape. I mean, because he's a football junkie. That's just what he is. And that was perfect for this market. I couldn't have brought in somebody who was an NBA junkie and been like, all right, let's go. Here we go. Oh, I know you don't know much football, but how about them Clippers? Nobody would have cared, and nobody still cares today. So you had to have somebody who was going to do that, and that's Michael. In a nutshell, Michael's not afraid to be opinionated. Michael didn't need to learn like I did how to be opinionated because he came in with an opinion and he wasn't afraid to express it. And that helped me immensely. I mean, him being the foil for me allowed me in some ways to be the, Nebraska guy who's just not for the program, obviously, because that was not what we were, but just sort of, I was this guy, Michael was that guy, and our natural differences, our natural background differences allowed us to play off each other, and it allowed both of us to grow in that role, and it allowed the station to grow as well. We took a giant leap forward when Michael was there, mainly because I'd been doing the show solo for 6 months, and anything would have been better than more solo Kevin Kugler.
Was he a security blanket for you in a way?
Very much so. Very much so. Because his football knowledge was significant. And so I could count on Michael to know the sport extremely well. So I could bring up stuff. And look, one of the tried and true sports talk things is you don't tell your partner. I was the so-called driver. So I'm getting us in and out of breaks, all that good stuff. But we'd do topics and I'd come up with stuff and I wouldn't tell Michael before the show. Now, Michael was working at KTV in the mornings at that time. So Michael was a zombie by the time he got to us half the days anyway, but I wouldn't tell him what we were talking about. And because I loved his natural reaction on the air, and his natural reaction is what got us in trouble sometimes, but it also provided some of the best moments that we ever had on that show. But yeah, somebody called him a crutch one time. He was a crutch on the show, and I think that bristled him a little bit, but he should never have thought of him. So I certainly didn't think he was my 1A. I mean, we couldn't have been that show without what Michael brought to the table. I did it myself solo. The show sucked. It was bad. I mean, I kept it between the navigational buoys, as Jimmy Buffett would have said, but it wasn't much better than that. Once we got Michael, it became what it was.
Did you and Michael ever butt heads when it came to this subject, when it came to the direction you were going, or were you guys pretty much in lockstep the whole time?
Well, we were close in lockstep. I mean, we obviously butted heads on a lot of different stuff. We come from very different backgrounds and very different political worlds and everything else. Although politics was never a part of this show to any certain degree, but it was a pretty easy move for us to make because we both believed in, I'm just going to say what I think and what I see. And, I'll defend it. But if somebody else has a different opinion, we'll welcome that too. So we never sat down before the show and said, all right, today let's go hard in on Callahan. All right, let's go strong after Peterson today, or let's rip this today. It was a reaction. And look, I felt like we had a pretty good pulse on what fans were feeling, especially in the later years of the 2007 year. The show took such a dramatic jump because of just the absolute devastation that was going on down in Lincoln that, every show we opened up with dramatic opens and sad moments, and we'd go on extra hours. And it was, and we were always on location on Mondays. And so we had people coming out, and it was, look, the bowl game that never was happened that year where Michael thought, it was Michael's idea. He thought we should do this simulated bowl game. And so I simulated a bowl game on my PS2 in the college football game. And all I did was record the first simulation I had. It was this dramatic Nebraska win over Notre Dame, two teams that didn't go to a bowl. And I'm like, all right, well, so they sold the remote. It was in December. It was at DJ's dugout. And I remember telling Michelle, my wife, as I'm leaving, I'm like, well, we'll see how this goes. I didn't think it was going to work. Michael was convinced it would work. I thought it was like, all right, we'll do it because it's December. What do I care? So we go down there. The place is packed at 1:00 before we go on the air. An hour before we go on the air, the place is packed. Little Red shows up. It was just this ridiculous, extravagant.
Wait, they sent Little Red?
They sent Little Red. Somebody got Little Red to show up. I don't know how. I have no idea how that happened. It's like, why would the university send Little Red to this thing? But here's they ran out of beer. It was just the craziest day maybe ever. And my job was to try to figure out how to marry this as an in-person event with, because we're still doing a radio show. So luckily we had a fake play-by-play guy who could come in and do some play-by-play of what was going on in the fake bowl game for the radio listeners so they could feel like they were involved. It was a ton of work. And it was in December. People are, oh, you're doing this for ratings. Here's a little inside radio. There are no ratings in December. Nobody's rating us. No. We got zip in the ratings for this thing. We just did it, and it was a remarkable success. I'm still convinced that's why DJ's Dugout stayed with us as our location for the next 3 years, because of that one day in December where we had 500 and some people in their bar on some random afternoon, drank them dry. And people are cheering like it's a real thing, a 2007 PS2 simulation. But those were those days. That was the halcyon days of the show. Jed came out one day to a show and brought a tombstone that had Steve Peterson. When he got fired, he brought a tombstone with Steve Peterson's tenure on it. That sat in the studio for years. Those were some very unique days.
Well, friends, it was a very unique time, and it certainly changed the way people listened to sports talk radio in this area. Kevin and Michael and everybody on the Zone gets a lot of credit for doing that, and the stuff that Josh and I and others do to this day probably isn't as possible. And certainly the Zone wouldn't have become what it was without that time period. I wish we had more time, but Kevin is a very busy man. He's getting ready for his next NFL on Fox assignment, or pinch hitting for Jason Benetti, wherever that may be. But and I wish we had more time. This would require its own, but we'll save it for the 50th anniversary of the Zone. How Creighton baseball played into one of the most important sketches in the history.
People have no idea how big a role Creighton baseball played in the evolution of some of the bits that were on that show. But that is a great episode for the 50th anniversary, assuming you or I can even remember anything by that point in our lives.
Probably won't.
Nope.
Kevin, thanks.
Thank you, John Bishop. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, you don't have to lie to me now. That'll do it. To hear more stories and memories of the last 25 years, Go to 1620thezone.com/25 years.